Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Hope y'all are doing well. Today we're back with some more Warpforge, and we're going to be looking at the meta report and just talking a little bit about, what that means for the game. Which factions and warlords are being underplayed, which ones are overperforming, or are more popular. And I think these meta reports, when they come out before the balance changes, you can sort of see the path that they're following of things that are more prevalent, should we be toning them down? Things that are least prevalent, how do you tone them up? And I'll be doing a separate video on the patch notes because I think there is quite a bit to discuss there, and there's actually been, a lot of feedback, I feel like, on the community Discord, especially about a few changes that I'll be interested to point out. But honestly, today I really want to get into, like, what do these meta reports mean? How much stock do we put in them? What does it actually mean for the game when collecting this data or trying to understand and use this data as a player, right? So I was able to finish on top of maybe someday we'll finish on top of the leaderboard, but this month we finished at, I think, 27 or 28. If you checked out my last video talking about my top 3 decks that I would recommend, feel free to take a look at that. And not too much of a spoiler. I don't know if that's going to change oh so much, even with the new patch coming out, but there definitely might be some percentages up or down on certain matchups and things like that. But here we are, and let's just start kind of at the top here. I scrolled through a little bit of the intro of the article, but I do think that for the health of the game, it's probably good for us to look at this, and definitely as a content creator, I kind of want to look at these different data points and look at sort of the health of the game. So we're looking at overall win rate, right? I think this is like basically up to the legendary division or potentially including the legendary division data. I don't think it's super clear, right? Just checking if I'm missing it. Yeah, no, I don't think there's any specifics on it. So interestingly enough, the global win rate for Black Legion is highest, followed very closely behind by the Necrons, Simhan. I always mess this up. I don't know why. I want to say Samhan. I don't think that's right. Ultramarines, Goth Orcs, and then at the bottom, the Tyranids, which I'm sure they're very upset about that and shrieking somewhere. And I think the use rate is interesting to think about, and this is definitely consistent with what I've seen. I feel like I play against and pair up against Black Legion very, very often. I think it's kind of just a very popular faction within the game. I think Ultramarines, over here, right, are pretty close behind that. And then everything else is kind of in this different range here on the lower end, ranging between 13% and 10% play rate. And so I think this is like just good to think about, in terms of like players' perceptions of the game, right? So at times I'll hear, like, oh, Chaos is broken, like they're so strong, like why aren't they nerfing them as much? And I think at times I'm like, oh, I just want to go in there and be a keyboard warrior and be like, well, actually they're not that great. Actually, some of the best decks have better matchups into Abaddon than you might think. But like if I step outside my own experience, right, this actually makes a lot of sense given this data, right? Because you're seeing Chaos like noticeably more than other factions, and their global win rate is the highest, right? It's not by a ton, right? But it does kind of like actually paint this picture that, okay, Black Legion is pretty popular in winning, quite a bit, excluding the legendary stats, and we'll definitely spend quite a bit of time on that, because not to say that the stats that are not legendary are unimportant, because they are very important. They sort of tell us a different message. But I'm very much interested, if I'm going to always be competing for the leaderboard, to really be looking at, like, what does that sort of landscape look like in terms of the data. And I think, Necron's still having a very high percent win rate overall, compared to the other factions, is interesting. It just means that they're still, putting up relatively good numbers, like pretty consistent. And then what's funny is I think Ultramarines and Samhan with the Eldar. Now I'm thinking about it every time I say it. I don't know why. That I think have some of the best like very consistent win rates in Legendary. We'll talk about that for a second. Have like a lower global win rate. So it's interesting to kind of think about like maybe even what players pick up very easily and what may be more challenging, right? I also think that Tyranids are a great example of that because even though their win rate here is like noticeably not good, right? You almost always want to have between 50 and 55. Like in the Magic world, right? If you were a competitive player, if you have over a 50% win rate and let's say closer to 55%, that's solid, right? Because there's a lot of variance in the game. But any game where you're looking at sub 50%, you've got a problem, right? And that is going to lead to some of the changes that we clearly see in the balance patch, and I won't spoil that too much. But so everything's relatively close. The standout is really the Leviathan Tyranids, and I don't think that's surprising. I think Tyranids are not easy to pilot, and I think that it requires like a very kind of expanded knowledge of the game. So it's not something you can plug and play. I think Black Legion, in a lot of cases, especially with Abaddon, is very straightforward. You're either capitalizing on your ability to add those dark packs to your units, or you're healing yourself, or you're just playing kind of big units, right, or just efficient units. That's all you got to do. For Necrons, they tend to be kind of more control focused. They're just kind of putting together answers, relatively easy to pick up and play in a lot of senses, but maybe not so much as the Black Legion. And then you've got Eldar and Ultramarines, which have a lot of shared kind of ways that they operate, especially with Madriel and Uriel kind of being these more aggressive options, where there's a little bit more of a percentage drop, especially with the Ultramarines, and that it may take a little bit more time for people to kind of like really play them at the win rate that we're going to talk about in Legendary. So this is really important because I usually am thinking about my content for new players or trying to get more people into the game and trying to get people, interested and kind of having a fair and honest, like good faith understanding of what this game is sort of showcasing, what it's doing, where its strengths and weaknesses are. So I think it's interesting to think about. We've got a really high use rate for Black Legion. We've also got a pretty decent win rate for them as well. So, if I was to recommend this to a new player, maybe that's where we would start, right? And I think when players can pick up something and feel successful at it, it's going to increase their likelihood to play the game, right? So this is actually really nice for me to look at because I don't play Black Legion at all. I don't want to say never, but I have like very little interest in playing Necrons. It just doesn't work for me, the play style. Pretty much every other faction I've been playing, and Black Legion I'm hoping to get to at some point. So it's kind of a good like perspective reset for me because I'm very entrenched in my like, this is my tier list, these are my top decks, right? But it is really good to kind of fact check that a bit and really look at some of those perceptions. So let me know what you think in the comments, right? Of like, does this data feel helpful? Is there stuff that we need to know more of? I think one of the very valid questions is like, does this factor in bot matches? I'm hoping not, because that would obviously inflate things to a degree. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that every deck should be able to beat a bot, right? So it would kind of just inflate everyone. But I don't know. I just think it would be nice to know a little bit more of the inner workings if they could release that. But let's get, I think, into the meat and potatoes of definitely what I want to talk about today as like a more competitive kind of focus, right? So here they write, in the Legendary divisions, the Eldari holds a comfortable lead with 58.29% win rate, followed by the heroic Ultramarines. And then keep an eye out for the Black Legion, boasting a win rate of 53%, promising power gifted from the Dark Gods. So what's interesting, and this is Legendary, right? So 2,500 plus, and there's a lot of variety, right? From or range, I should say. In order for me to be where it was in the leaderboard, I had to hit 3,700, so that's plus 1,200 from the Legendary division. But we've got people who have grinded up until 4,300, right? And I think if you've got a deck that's putting up close to 60% win rate, like that's not that hard to do. or at least like you've got a pretty good chance of doing it. So Eldari, although not terribly popular globally, right? They're kind of middle of the pack. Um, they are boasting the best win rate, followed pretty closely by Ultramarines, then Black Legion, then Goth Orcs. And I will say I was sort of surprised by the Orcs. I know they've been hit with a bit of nerfs after, Mr. Gaz was absolutely oppressive. But it felt like with the reinforcement drop, they actually got a lot of interesting new tools that maybe we'll see a bit more. I would be really surprised if we don't see a change in the orc win rate going into this next season, because I do think Control Gaz is the real deal. I do think that it's a highly competitive deck. Eldari and Ultramarines for this last season, I'm not surprised. It felt like they had a level of consistency that I just didn't feel with other decks. I mostly played Ultramarines, not a terrible amount of Eldar, but I played against a lot of Eldar. I think Eldar and Black Legion were my most frequent matchups. And we look at Black Legion, that was really huge. At the beginning of the season, I played against a lot of Ultramarines, and that kind of died down. I think people were just kind of sick of playing Uriel, most likely. I did not get as sick of it though, because it really, I really feel like I was closer to like a 60% win rate with everything when all was said and done. Um, and interestingly, although Tyranids boast a much more reasonable win rate in the legendary division, they're still just barely getting above 51, and Necrons taking a huge hit noticeably at 48% in the legendary division. So Balduco is a really great Necrons player, plays the hell out of it. I think there are a couple other ones that are not coming to mind right now, but that's a huge change, right? Also, the use rate just like absolutely plummeted, and that was after quite a few nerfs from last patch. So I think we saw the effect of that take hold. I still think that Necrons are pretty competitive, and we'll talk about some of the changes that we'll see in the patch, but it's definitely worth noting. I can't remember the last time Necrons were really struggling in the legendary division. Imhotep has kind of always held his own, and we're definitely seeing a shift where that deck really took a dive in a much more aggressive meta, specifically with Uriel coming out on top, or Madrel, depending on how you want to look at it. Um, and so even even with that, now other content creators, and I think Ecclesiarch said it really well. If Goth Orcs, especially with this Gaz control deck, end up kind of taking off, then we might see Necrons kind of resurge, right? Because they have some really great tools to go toe to toe, probably in a slower meta. I still think they have some really decent staying power in an aggressive meta, specifically the Stormlord Imhotep, but we're definitely seeing that they really kind of come away as the losers for this patch, and Ultramarines and Eldari, kind of really being jettisoned up to the highest win rates. So what does this mean, right? When I look at this, I'm like, okay, we're gonna see some Eldari nerfs. I would be surprised if we don't see some sort of nerf that specifically targets Uriel in that build. And I would imagine we'll see, maybe a reversion or like a buff for Necrons, and then probably some more love for the Tyranids. Although Saltec Dynasty had the lowest win rate in Legendary for this patch, there was obviously a lower play rate as well. I think that Tyranids have kind of struggled the most, and I say that because although Saltec Dynasty has Imhotep kind of as the poster child, Scarabs are still around. It has been nerfed. I think people have just kind of completely moved off it. I don't know that it's dead necessarily. But for Tyranids, if you're not playing Swarmlord, you're basically doing it wrong at the legendary level, let's say, right? So 2500 plus, you're trying to compete at the highest level. You should be playing Swarmlord. And I think these kind of like one, uh, Warlord factions, it's not really healthy for the game. Um, and even though Uriel is in my opinion miles noticeably better than Tigurius and Calgar right now, I still think that you can boast a pretty decent win rate with Ultramarines, even if you're playing different warlords, right? I don't think you can really do that with with Tyranids. I think it's kind of harder. Orcs kind of have this like wealth of options that you can use. Black Legion really only has Abaddon. Uh, uh, for Eldari, I do think that Mr. Zephyrblade, Eliak, I think, um, Mr. Zephyrblade. This is like the teacher in me, Mr. Zephyrblade. Um, is competitive. I do think that it's probably a little bit worse than running Madriel. Um, but I think that they're competitive. So we've got some problems in the sense that we've got a bunch of high win rates for certain factions that are almost specifically and only tied to one warlord within that faction. So when you see people being upset or kind of raging about like one faction being so strong, or like, why do I keep playing against Chaos? Why do I keep playing against Ultramarines? It's also upsetting in a different way because it would probably feel less bad if you played against different Ultramarine warlords, different Chaos warlords, right? Different, Tyranid warlords, right? Where you're seeing different strategies, not the same kind of like stock list cut and pasted into each warlord, right? Now, granted, and I want to give some credit here, right? Like the card pool is small, so it really just comes down to which warlord suits the overall card pool strategy or has the most winningest strategy, and which warlord is going to be the best fit with that. So, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but I think the overall message is even when you're looking at win rates, it's important to look at use rates. And I would say it's even more important to look at use rates for warlords specifically, right? Because that's really going to, if we're looking at this from the perspective that EG has shared, right, which is we want to boost up, the guys who aren't doing well, and we kind of want to tamp down on the guys who are doing well, right, and sort of get the power level, if you will, kind of a little bit flatter. Then it's going to take some maneuvering, not just within the faction, but within specific warlords, right? And I kind of want to use for the Goth Orcs, I kind of want to use Gordrang as an example, right? We kind of already know that warlords that have essentially like a one-sided ability are going to suffer, right? And so when Abaddon could heal himself, and Abaddon just could give him Mark of Chaos, he was not good enough, right? He was okay, like people could probably get him above a 50% win rate, but that change made that warlord like the most viable, right? And so Gordrang is probably going to struggle from the same thing, that it's an aggressive ability, right? But if they've got a Vanguard unit, if it's going to really damage you to use that, right? There's no secondary use case, really, right? So I think moving forward, when it comes to warlord design, I would like there to be more modality in the game. And it's not that I want things to be cut and copy pasted versions of each other and like, well, yeah, maybe if we give, Gordrang a heal just like Abaddon. No, I want it to be kind of flavorful. I want it to be, sensical, a sensible change, right? Nothing too crazy, right? Not going over the top like we did with Gaz. But just something that's like on brand, but just gives a little bit of modality, because then what it might come down to is player preference or play style or specific micro synergies within the card pool. And I think that is much healthier for a game, because then you're not playing against the same list, the same strategy all the time. Now, I know it feels hypocritical, right? Of me, and I'll just scroll down as I'm wrapping up this thought. Might seem hypocritical of me who pushes out, here's a deck, copy paste it, use it, right? But that's mostly because I want people to like find success with like a framework, right? And it's kind of like, it's what my old piano teacher used to say. Once you learn the scale, forget it, right? If you want to learn how to improvise, you have to know what the rules are and then bend or break those rules. So I want to provide a very clear idea of the rules in terms of deck building and what's successful, so that then we can innovate, right? Or that we can be okay and say, you know what, I think this is the best meta deck, but if I wanted to try something different, here we go. Um, so let's look at the win rates and the use rates for the Warlords, because I think this is really another interesting piece of data, right? So this month, Abaddon has become an Ender of Worlds, reaching a commanding 58.7% win rate. Definitely the most consistent Chaos Warlord, and a very popular one. However, the Despoiler can't afford to get too comfortable on his throne. Swarmlord is closing in, securing the second position with a win rate of 58.2%. And Tech maintains his reputation as one of the deadliest strategists right under that. So this definitely supports, a lot of what we were even just saying, right? And I actually forgot this section was on here. So we're really trying to divine from these stats, and I think being pretty on point, right? So user rate for these warlords, I think, is really important. They organized by win rate. I kind of would have been interested to see if we like flipped it. So what was the highest? Uriel, right? So Uriel had the highest user rate. Oh, no. I need to do math. This is Harkin. That's super surprising. So Harkin had the highest use rate for this patch and boasted a 53.1% win rate. I can't remember when I played against Harkin this season, so that's really interesting. Uriel makes a lot of sense to me. And then we've got things like Nemezer coming in at 8%, which is like relatively high compared to what I thought. And then we have Abaddon at 7% win rate or use rate. So win rates, Abaddon, no surprise. Swarmlord, no surprise. Imatech, right? These are the poster children, essentially, of their faction. Eliak is interesting that this had a higher win rate than Madrail down here. And then Sylar, honestly, very surprising too. But, this makes me think about, like, maybe we are overlooking certain warlords. Who knows? Calgar surprises me as well. Gaz, not a surprise. Neurothrope, I still think can definitely win games. Anvir as well. And then it's interesting to see the win rate by a warlord be at 52% for Madrail, right? And for Uriel, it was only 50.2%. So it's also really interesting to look at like these global, like bigger, huge pool of data, and then look at Legendary Division, because it looks very different, right? Like if you were looking at this, you'd be like, wow, Abaddon's super strong, Swarmlord's super strong, Imatech's really strong, Eliak is super strong, right? And these are sort of the poster children of their, and Calgar's still on top. That's not at all what I feel or what we've observed in the top 50 or just in Legendary Division. So it is interesting to think about. And I think, whether it's use rate or not, like win rate for Turvigon being 38%, Terra Vardengast 40%, right? This would already kind of draw my eye to like, all right, we need to make the Tyrannid experience better, right? Potentially look at some of the inconsistencies or issues with orcs, right? And then probably anything above here, you don't really have to prioritize. And I am surprised by some of these win rates, right? But they're not necessarily talking about the upper echelon of what people are playing, right? So let's get to one of the other more important sections, which is Legendary Division standouts, right? Even among the legends, certain figures emerge as paragons of strategy. Uriel Ventures, after claiming last month one of the top spots, has ascended down to the first position with a 60% win rate. This is exactly what it felt like to play this Warlord throughout this whole season. Madrail closely behind. And then Swarmlord, interestingly enough, not that much further behind, right? But is just the best option for Tyranids. And then Abaddon with, boasting a very huge user rate, right? 56.7. Anvir close behind LAX. So we are seeing the Eldar edge into all three warlords in Legendary Division are boasting a very, very solid win rate, right? We've only got Uriel for Space Marines, right? We've only got Swarmlord for the Tyranids, right? And then we've got some of the orcs kind of following the pack just right above 50%. Calgar, right? And then we have a clear drop off here, right? Imatech now not even hitting 50. Gordrang, I tried the heck out of this patch. This is roughly what I would say as well. Neurothrope, Zagstruck, which is kind of like a strictly war scourge ring, so I'm not surprised by that. And then again, right, like I didn't see any Harkin, so I'm not surprised. 44%. Oricon, Sylar, Numezer, Terror of our. It's it's crazy how different of a picture the use rate and win rate is between legendary and the rest of the ladder. It is such a it's a huge discrepancy in the percentages, and I think it's really good to keep that in mind. I forgot they had the drafts as well. It's interesting. I know there are quite a few players that really like drafting, and I do think uh, Chaos have always had like a pretty good setup. So has Orcs in general and Gaz for that. So um, I think just to close out, just because like draft is a lot of it's affected by what you open up, right? You can have like 3 Makaris in your deck for Orcs, so obviously you're probably going to do pretty well because it kind of breaks the inherent rules of the game, right? With one copy of a legendary. This is exactly what. What's interesting is this tension always, as kind of this closing point, is between what does the greater community see as problems with the game, and then what do the top tier players see as issues in the game, right? So even though Uriel has literally a 10% drop off if it's outside of Legendary Division, um, should we be nerfing Uriel? Even though Madrail, Anvir, and Eliak or basically the Eldar card pool, right? Kind of regardless of the Warlord is very strong and legendary, right? It's not seeing that much play globally, right? So what does that mean, right? And then even thinking about Tyranids, right? Does it mean, oh my God, Swarmlord's like 57% win rate? That's crazy. Like, do we need to nerf Tyranids, right? And I think the answer is no. Like if anything, Tyranids need to have more options and not have to play this one play style, which is kind of where Ultramarines are too. But I wouldn't advocate for buffing them either because they're generally just kind of like pretty well rounded. Um, but I think when you look at this, like, the Eldar stand out, so I'm not surprised in the video for the patch we'll talk about the changes that there were some nerfs thrown at Eldar, there were some nerfs thrown at Uriel Ventress specifically, and then we saw I think there's quite a few changes when it comes to Tyranids. So it's a lot of data to digest, right? We've got global win rates and use rates for factions. We've got global win rates and use rates for warlords. We've got legendary win rates and use rates for factions and warlords. I'm going to usually be most concerned about legendary division, which spans from 2,500 and up, because that's mostly where I'm always going to be playing. But I do think we need, and I think EG always needs to be considering, why is this faction have a low use rate? Or I would say warlords in particular is important data to pay attention, because that's what they're trying to target, right? Like Turvagon, not looking too hot in legendary, right? Varro, maybe not Varro specifically, but Terra Vardengast. We've got these kind of like other, just always inconsistent warlords. So what needs to be done, and so data's not the end all be all, right? It's flawed in certain ways, right? We don't have all the specifics, but I do think that this, looking at this particular graphic, really lines up with my kind of personal perception of the game. And so why, even as a Space Marines player, I probably would advocate for some sort of nerf to Uriel, some sort of nerf probably to the Eldari. And I actually called one of the changes for the Eldari, I think, or yeah, because they had 2. Because I think if you're going to target certain strategies, you want to pick very particular cards that are not going to, like, it's not going to just make the deck fall apart, right? It's just going to be, oh, maybe we can't close out the same way. Maybe we have a little bit more RNG. Maybe we have a little less consistency. Maybe there's a piece, like, you don't want to just like nerf a card out of existence. You want to take more of a measured approach, I think. And it's worked and it's not worked for EG, but I do think that they take the most kind of good faith approach I've seen in a while for trying to use the data to their understanding of what the players are dealing with. And we don't want to worry about just the top 50 or just the legendary division. We do want to worry about the overall health of the game. So anyway, I'm sure this is long enough. Thank you for sticking with me if you have. And I just really wanted to do a little bit of theory crafting, a little bit of, kind of sitting down and thinking about, where this game is at, where it's going, excited for whatever else is here to come. And I think the more we can utilize this data as a community, but also just as the ones who are balancing the game with EG, hopefully we can use it to a place where things just are better for the new players and better for the players that are sticking around. So thanks for hanging out with me, and I will catch you later.